Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're located. Welcome to our webinar series. My name is Manuela Hartwig, and I will be moderating this session. I am a project researcher at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo, and this webinar is part of the Social Scenario Research Program towards a carbon neutral society funded by the Japan Science and Technology Agency. Before we get started, I would like to announce a few housekeeping points. The webinar will be recorded and put up on our website later, along with the presentation materials. You may share your comments and questions in the chat because the video and microphone functions are turned off. And can you hear me? Okay. Couldn't you hear me before?
Just for a brief second, you turned mute, but now you're unmuted again.
Okay, so I can continue. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Caroline Zim is a research scholar jointly associated with the Transformative Institutional and Social Solutions Research Group of the IIASA, that is the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, at the IIASA's Energy, Climate and Environmental Program, and the Equity and Justice Research Group of the Population and Just Societies Program. Dr. Zim currently works on the international research initiatives of the Earth Commission of the Global Common Alliance, and she leads the IIASA strategic initiative, the Just Transitions to Net Zero Carbon Emissions for All. Her research is concerned with the diffusion of technologies and policies for sustainable development, inequalities across countries, and transformative development pathways for humanity within a stable Earth system. And prior to joining IIASA in 2014, Dr. Zim worked in development cooperation and on consulting projects in the field of rural energy supply, energy access, and climate change. She held positions within the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, a private consulting firm, and the German Development Agency, where she was based in Cambodia and India. And today's talk will be about advancing justice considerations in climate scenario research. Caroline, the floor is yours.
So, thanks a lot. We tested the screen sharing and now I hope it works again. Let me know if this is projected and you can see it.
It's there.
Okay, super. Good. Thank you so much, Manuela, for this kind introduction, and thank you to Masa for inviting me to participate in this series. For those of you who don't know IIASA, we are an international research organization just outside of Vienna in Austria. And we work on systems analysis, as our name also indicates. And so this means that we work very interdisciplinary, and we always look from various perspectives on different systems, different system boundaries. And the work that I will present today is, I would say, a consolidation or the current status that emerges out of several research projects. The first was already mentioned by Manuela on Just Transitions for All, Just Trans for All. This was a special project that IIASA internally organized to bring in a more diverse perspective from justice within our modeling within IIASA, and I will show you aspects of this. And then the project already closed last year actually, and I was leading this. And now these efforts are being continued in several projects at IIASA, and two of these I will show you. One is the Elevate project, which is a Horizon project, where IIASA with several other institutions is working on continuing this within the modeling work. And one iteration of this is the JustMIP efforts, is Justice Model Intercomparison project, where we try to more systemically look at some justice elements across different models and in the modeling community. I should say at the beginning that I am myself, I'm not a modeler, but I work with a lot of modelers. So for some of the detailed questions later on, I will then refer you to other colleagues. I'm happy to establish these connections. But now let's get started. And I understand that later after this talk, we will have questions. Okay, so what will you hear about? First, we will speak about terminology. So there's many different perspectives and considerations within the broader aspect of climate justice. Then we will take a look on justice and climate mitigation scenarios and some critiques and elements that have been identified for a need for improvement. And then we will look at some of these advances that are currently being discussed and how they're implemented, and we will see how much time we have, how much detail we will discuss in this. Okay. I'm not sure about the Japanese context, but at least in Europe in recent years, when there were climate rallies, these were typical billboards that you could see on the street where people in these climate protests were asking for climate justice. Maybe for yourself, reflect a bit on what you connotate with these images when you see this. What does it mean to you? What do you think of? Yeah. And the challenge here is that everybody, or not everybody, but many people think of many different things when they actually speak about climate justice, yeah. And this is where I want to come in here, that we dissect this a bit and look at all the different components that are relevant in climate justice and that are especially relevant in different contexts. And this is then also relevant for the modeling and for which kind of models you use. So within our Just Dance for All project, when we thought about, okay, if you have the world and you want to normatively bring the world to a better place, you have different pathways, as you see this here in this icon. In this project, we worked, as I mentioned, very interdisciplinary. So we had demographers, we had the integrated assessment modelers from the team that I'm working on. We had political economists, but we also had a philosopher in the team who helped us disentangle these different considerations. And the project, the one big element of the project was to find shared language, as I mentioned, shared terminology, shared categories and constructs, so that different disciplines can actually work together on this topic. And also what was very important is to be reflexive on your own work and understand what happens within your own work with regards to justice. Yeah, and this is something that we wanted to depict here with this comic image, that everybody thinks of something else when they talk about climate justice. Yeah, you might have people who think about, okay, access to food. Others think about participation in decision-making processes. For others, it's about climate and health impacts with increasing climate change, or access to water resources. Yeah, so you have all these different elements, and when you only talk about climate justice, it's very hard to actually understand what the others are speaking about. And this also then makes it, of course, very difficult to implement in quantitative modeling. So one of the big first key messages that I want to give you is to be very specific in what you talk about when you talk about justice. So here, when we think about different justice considerations in climate research, as I mentioned, there are many different dimensions. When you look here at this icon, you could first say, okay, there's this context of climate justice. Yeah, this could be mitigation or adaptation or loss and damage, and we'll get to this in more detail. In the next circle, you have the spatial scope, the temporal scope, and the entity scope. And there's many different ways of how you can look at this. This is a more abstract version, but when you look, for example, at the temporal scope, this can mean then intergenerational justice. When you think about future generations, for example, spatial scope could mean, are you looking only within your country, or do you also look globally at justice across different countries? The entity is something that is new in the sense of that, do we think very anthropocentric? Is it only about humans? Or do we also think about justice with regards to other living species, animals, for example? Or also plants. I mean, and there's also movements for rivers to encompass them in the justice discourse. And then within this, you have different forms of justice. Yeah. And when we think about modeling, because a lot of the models that we work with at IATO, they're quantitative models. So it's often about distributing something. Yeah. How are benefits or burdens shared between groups? Yeah. So for example, the global carbon budget. Yeah. But then this is only one form of justice. We also have procedural justice. Yeah. What are the rules and principles used to make a decision? And for example, within modeling, this can both be how are actually research questions designed, or who can ask those research questions? Is it only the researchers, or is it also other actors that are interested in the research? But it could also be, how is procedural justice reflected within the models? Yeah, so there's different elements to that. We then have also corrective justice. If there has already been previous injustice, how do you deal with this? So if you already have climate impacts, how do you account for that? This is also something that we try to do in the models. Recognitional justice, like who is involved in these processes, who is involved in the decision making, as I already mentioned, that whose knowledge is accounted for. Here, for example, you could also think about indigenous knowledge. And then we have transitional justice, which is rather new. And this is also something that we want to try to reflect in our models that look across time and change and policy implementation. Like, what are the trade-offs that we can make if we progress towards more justice in that sense? Yeah. So what is the time period in between? How is that characteristic? These forms of justice, they're not mutually exclusive. As already from my explanations, you can see that they're quite overlapping in some sense. But also you can see here that it's very broad, right? And of course, a single model cannot capture everything. Different techniques and different research types will lend themselves more towards giving information on some of these aspects. And so when speaking about something like a scenario that looks into justice, also it's always good to be also very transparent in saying, okay, this is actually what I focus on, and there are certain things that I can't do, but there's some things that I can improve on in the future. And this is also something that I'll show you with the advances in the modeling community. Okay, so I think now we have sufficient terminology to get going. When we look at the origins of climate justice in the connection to environmental justice, so climate justice is relatively new, I would say. So this emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the first real impact of climate justice were felt in a more broader space, versus environmental justice, which emerged mostly from the US, already within the civil rights movement, already in the 60s and 70s. When you compare the two, they're not mutually exclusive, but broadly you could say that climate justice has a more global dimension, because it does also look at these global differences, while environmental justice is more on local pollution, maybe on regional disparities and national injustices, with a big focus on racial and class backgrounds. Because of this legacy from the civil rights movement in the US, climate justice has more this long-term intergenerational aspect, even though we also looked at climate justice elements that are not only across generations, but also within, in current impacts. And environmental justice is more into immediate environmental hazards, for example, air pollution, maybe from a industrial facility, or water pollution. And climate justice is more connected to global environmental movements, international NGOs, and as I mentioned already, the environmental justice is more in the civil rights movement. But of course, over the years, they have become more intertwined. And this is just to give you a context in this historic evolvement. Here you see that climate justice is really gaining visibility. This is a chart that shows how climate justice is used in global media. It's unfortunately cut off in 2021. It would be much higher if we had continued, I assume. But you can really see how, especially since Copenhagen and then later on after the Paris Agreement in 2015, it really has been picking up. And this it's also something that was really at these international fora pushed from both Global South activists, but also from international NGOs to be more on the international agenda. And this is also something that in parallel, climate justice as a terminology has also entered research. Yeah? A lot of the elements that climate justice is related to have been in research before, climate impacts and different development challenges, but that really also the terminology has entered different strands of research is basically reflecting this chart in the last 10 or so years. And of course, some disciplines are faster than others. Yeah? In some disciplines, especially in critical geography, sociology, these aspects have been looked at for longer already. And then some disciplines like quantitative modeling, especially with regard to this terminology, they are more recently only picking this up, but they did look at content-wise, they have always been looking at these questions, how to distribute burden, how to distribute access to the carbon budget, for example. So before we get into, and because I spoke just about the issue of climate justice within research, one underlying element also within is the issue of diversity in research that is connected to climate justice, because it always depends on who is doing the research. That also then reflects different accounts of climate justice, And of course, we have this very skewed situation that the most influential climate scientists, they are based in certain regions that have a dominating role within academia. You see here that Europe and North America are dominating, and very few African and very few female researchers on this Reuters hot list of the most influential climate scientists. There's also certain disciplines that are dominating, and of course, then certain questions get asked less, And this is a challenge within the climate justice discourse, We have this global north bias within also the highly cited climate research papers. And within this context of the global north bias, there's a very strong bias towards researchers from the US because it's a very strong academic area so far, at least. I mean, this, especially with regards to climate justice, this might change with the current situation there. And this relates to the general challenges within academia of the funding and languages and access to journals and equipment. Also, that contributions from Global South researchers are not sufficiently reflected or acknowledged. And this is something that is underlying the knowledge base, right? That is also going into the IPCC and the research questions asked. And just that we are aware of this, that this is something when we look at the research that is out there on climate justice, it's of course also connected to this issue. Okay, moving on. Now this is not moving. Oh yeah, okay now. So I talked a lot about climate justice, and it's really hard to actually say what climate justice is. It's a lot easier to say what climate injustice is, And here I want to quote Dr. Salim Hook, who until his death in 2023, he was a negotiator from Bangladesh, and he had participated in every single COP and had I think, a very good perspective of the dealings with climate justice and climate impact. And I would like to read this quote to you because it's really, it summarizes very nicely what climate injustice is. And so he says, in my view, is that the question should be, why does climate injustice matter at all? Climate justice is an abstract notion that is not easy to explain or understand, but climate injustice is clear and visible and needs to be rectified. In this reframing, the climate change issue can be characterized as pollution by rich people and rich countries, adversely impacting poor people, both in rich and in poor countries. This is morally wrong, and every religion teaches that this is wrong. Therefore, if we accept this premise that it is incumbent on each and every person on the planet to take requisite actions to tackle climate change, for those of us whose personal carbon footprint is higher than the global average, we must try to reduce wherever we can, but that is not enough. So we also need to mobilize with allies to push our respective political leaders to take the actions they have already agreed to do in the Paris Agreement, but are not doing in practice. Finally, we should also reach out to the victims of human-induced climate change in the most vulnerable communities in developing countries to express solidarity and support, and to help them adapt to the adverse impact of climate change and also deal with the loss and damage that is now a reality. So what do we have here? We have the impacts, we have mitigation, we have adaptation, and also we have loss and damage. And so this was the scope that I explained to you before. And when we now look at this global perspective, what does this lead to? So this gives us actually a triple injustice of climate change, because we have the most vulnerable who are negatively with the negative impact of climate change. Those are the ones that bear like little responsibility for causing it. So we have the whole responsibility discussion. These groups have also limited resources and capacity to cope with the effects of climate change. This is first a double injustice, but then it can become a triple injustice if we now add a green transition, like decarbonization, to the challenge, because this can actually negative low-income and vulnerable groups, or it can also impede the development trajectories of countries. And this is often an argument because they cannot use their natural resources as freely in fossil fuels, for example. And then you could argue there's a quadruple injustice because this all comes on top of already existing development challenges, yeah, with getting people sufficient education and healthcare services and all of that, yeah. So to give the context of the scope of the challenge, basically, yeah. Okay. Now moving to models. I moved this too fast. So at YASA, we have integrated assessment models. These models, especially in our group, they show how economy, energy, and land resources are connected and how this then relates to how population development and demands from society in economy, energy, and land and food then are connected to greenhouse gas emissions. And within these models, we can ask what if questions, yeah? What if we have different carbon prices by region? Or what if renewable energy deploys even faster than expected? And what if we ensure that key development goals, such as in the SDGs, are met? What does this all mean for energy demand? What does this mean for greenhouse gas emissions? And how does this all add up, yeah? So we have these input data of demographic projections, for example, and socioeconomics, the technology diffusion, the prices for technology, and then the models. With the models, we can answer these questions. And then, for example, with these different scenario runs where we use different constraints on, okay, you can use so much biomass, for example, or you have to stay within this certain carbon budget, you get different scenario runs. And then you can, this is used, for example, within the IPCC to provide scientific input to the policy negotiation process. This is now a very quick run through the types of questions we can ask with the models we use at YASA. More on terminology, just to be clear on the difference between a forecast, a projection or scenario, and the pathway, because these are often used interchangeably. Forecasts are really based on extrapolation of past trends. So, okay, if I have the energy price of the last couple of months, what will the price be, for example, in the next quarter? It's very trend-driven, it's predictive. What in these models that I just showed you, or what we will talk about more, the scenarios, we really want to explore possible predictions under consistent assumptions. Yeah. So if the population has this size and if the technology is that efficient, this leads to, yeah, it's very exploratory and it's really very closely connected to the assumptions that you use as inputs and as constraints within the models and how the model is also set up. And then something else that is also often discussed, which today we will not go into detail, are pathways. Yeah, these are narrative scenarios aimed at achieving a certain goal, for example, net zero or achieving the SDGs. So a normative objective that you want to achieve. And you really concentrate on that goal. And then you try to look at the configurations that you need to actually achieve that goal. Yeah. So that we are clear on these distinctions. So often with the scenarios, we look at a very broad range of possible futures without a judgment of what is more. I mean, of course, there are assessments of uncertainties, but it doesn't mean that this is the future that will occur. Yeah. Good. When we now look at the models here, this is from the Elevate project that I mentioned more. So there's, of course, within the models, a lot happens already. Yeah, we have all these assumptions that are within the models, how they are set up, how the economy is reflected. And these colleagues did a expert elicitation on how can models actually improve with regards to justice. Yeah, what can they do better? Yeah, because there's always room for improvement. There have been several critiques, and this was very expert-based, but they asked modelers within the IAM community. They asked colleagues who are not themselves modelers, but who work with IAMs. And they also asked experts, policymakers who just use who are the recipients of insights from IAMs. And there are many different elements in this expert decision came up, and you can basically summarize these improvements or needed improvements within these models for, first of all, better communication, involvement in the processes, and transparency, so that models should be clearer about their assumptions, because all these assumptions are related to justice, and I will give you some examples. That the models as such, and also the scenarios that are looked at as such, they are too much climate focused, and they should better avoid negative effects on nature. So the link between climate and biodiversity should be enhanced. And in addition to that, they should better incorporate development concerns, especially of global South countries, that this is not sufficiently reflected. And this is also connected to what I said before. Of course, the communities that work on the models and the skewed representation of who does this research. So this is basically the starting point for improvements within the IAM community. And this is, I'll present to you some preliminary work from a paper that is led by Shonali Pachari, my supervisor, that we have been all working together in the last couple of months. And here we have further dissected these elements on improvement elements within the models. So we summarized the structural improvements that are needed, the epistemological improvements within the models themselves, and the methodologically, what kind of elements they look at. And just to give you an example, because I had mentioned this on the assumptions, the discount rates are very relevant for intergenerational justice, for example. Mitigation timing, like when do I deploy large mitigation options? How much future technologies like CDR do I still need? This is very much relevant for the timing of net zero. A challenge that is also always mentioned within the IAMs is that they are very cost efficiency focused. So it's all about reducing costs. A very economically driven perspective, but you could also argue, why not look at other elements like livelihoods, well-being, life expectancy. So to look at new indicators, this is also something that is mentioned in indicator breadth, because what is actually relevant to humanity. Then in the structural component, something that I already mentioned is the diversity in who does the modeling, and also the IAM reflexivity that is mentioned here, in the sense of that IAMs are aware of their limits and of their strongholds, like what can they really, where can they be useful and say a lot about, and what are the areas that they might not be able to say much about. So we summarized this in an article that I hope will come out in early 2026. And we also scaled the level of advances. So first we have to do the refinement within our existing frameworks. So there's basically a long to-do list of what we can immediately do to have better representation of justice in different elements. We have to also fundamentally reconfigure some of how the models are set up. But then, and this is one of the big challenges, is that we have to work more with participatory and other complementary approaches, because those quantitative IAMs, they have certain limits, and for those we would have to then reach out to others, and especially for the elements of procedural justice that I mentioned before, closer work with stakeholders, policymakers, those who are the recipients and users of the scenarios that we work with, is needed, because then we might actually improve on if we look at the scenario configurations that are interesting to the policymakers. So that is the opportunity space that I described to you actually reflects potential future scenarios that are reflective of the priorities of policymakers. And for this, we need more participatory approaches. Okay, So within the sphere of IMs, there's, as I had mentioned, there's many different ongoing projects where different elements of these critiques of these needed advancements are already being covered. So when, for example, the whole connection between climate and biodiversity is very closely connected to the food and land system, and there's several recent articles going on how this can be improved here on the left side. Then also allocating remaining carbon budgets. And how this can be done in a more fair or with a higher diversity in fairness aspects is also something that is being worked on, for example, by my colleague Setu Pels, and we will get to this later also. And then just on this reflexivity and awareness on what kind of aspects of justice we are working on. This was a paper that I led within this Just Transfer All project that I had mentioned. And then also different elements of inequality and that we have this larger opportunity space with different accounting for these different development challenges across countries. So to be broader in the diversity of economic futures. This is also something that has been critiqued a lot. Good. So now I want to come to this effort that I had mentioned at the beginning, the Justice Model Intercomparison Project. This is really an attempt to more systematically embed justice into integrated assessment models across different models and increasing the complementarity. This QR code should work and it should lead you to the modeling protocol. The JustMIP is spearheaded by Yasser under the Elevate project, but also within the Earth Commission that I'm part of. We have 19 international partners from both Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. There have been many consultations with policymakers in the design of this. The protocol that is behind this effort is available for public review and feedback. So please take a look, and I'll give you a snapshot of what the project is about. And it's really also one effort to try to be more open, have more diverse collaborations, and get better integration across global, national, and subnational models. So what are the research questions that are explored under JustMIP? Because we have these question-driven scenarios that we're looking at, and so this choice is very important. Also, this was the result of a consultative process, and we have 4 main priority research questions. So first is, what are the implications of meeting minimum energy needs necessary to achieve decent living standards? This is the acronym for DLS, for climate mitigation targets. So this really looks at this development first approach on what do you need for a decent life. The second research question is, what are the implications of different distributions of resources and equity assumptions for climate mitigation efforts, targets? So the different distribution related then to the carbon budget and how you could differentiate this. Also looking into historic responsibilities in the next research questions. What are the implications of recognizing historical responsibilities and fostering cooperative effort sharing for climate mitigation targets? And the last research question, what are the implications of the interactions between meeting these minimum energy needs and the effort sharing? So are there trade-offs between these different objectives? Yeah. So both the historical responsibilities and the minimum energy needs, which is often sidelined in research. All of this, as I've mentioned the constraints before, so we have very high sustainability constraints, both on biomass, this is relevant for biodiversity, but also on geological carbon storage, this is relevant for the timing and the overshoot in temperature, and all under stringent climate targets. Okay. This is now, we will revisit these forms of justice that we saw at the beginning of the talk. So here you see that JustMIP does speak to procedural, recognitional, distributional, corrective justice partly. Transitional justice we have not covered. JustMIP also speaks to intergenerational, interregional, and interspecies justice. So this was the scope ring that we saw before, because it does look at the justice aspects across regions, but also across generations, and also because it covers elements of biodiversity, and it gives back land to nature. It does look at this interspecies justice. This is within the framing of the Earth system justice that also came out of the Global Commons Alliance and Earth Commission. So you can see there's many different ways of framing the question, but it all comes down to similar, I would say, concepts. Yeah. And then within the core, what we represent within the IAMs, because there's so many different things that you can do within the IAMs. We do look at the effort sharing. We look at the foundation, the decent living standards, and this component of biodiversity. Yeah. So this is just MIP in I would say in a quick run through. So when we look at now, how does this actually look at in the models? What happens? Yeah. Here we look at the decent living energy needs within the climate mitigation pathways and how this is improved upon in the pathways. So first of all, decent living standards. These look at energy needs per capita for different key services. So this could be for housing. Think of thermal comfort, heating and cooling, health and hygiene. What are the energy requirements that a working health system has? Mobility. Accounting for different mobility needs in the sense of reaching places, being connected. Nutrition, the energy that is needed to get everyone a decent amount of kilocalories per day. And then also education and socialization. So the education system, if everybody gets a certain degree of secondary education, I think is the standard here. Yeah. And if we want to raise the achievement level of these outcomes with the current system, we will need to reach energy requirements. And you see here on the right-hand side the distribution that we currently have with regards to energy. And because several people are below the minimum needs, and if you want to lift them, we would have higher energy needs when we lift these people. But at the same time, because we have these constraints, we would reduce high energy consumption per capita. So we change the distribution. Yeah. And here we can look at different equity implications. Yeah. So you can play around with this distribution. So from this bottom-up assessment of the energy needs for a decent life, we come to a new configuration of the inequality. So this is the decent living energy needs within these mitigation pathways. And for further questions, I would ask you to get in touch with my colleague Jarmo Kikstra, who is leading this component. And then next, I mentioned already carbon debt, work that my colleague Seto Peltz has been leading. This is based on an already published paper from this year. This is how we can look at and better account for regional responsibilities with regards to climate change, but also looking at the future. And so when we have a global carbon budget remaining, in general, we had a global carbon budget to stay within the Paris Agreement. You have either carbon debt of a country, that is if the past and the future emissions under current trajectories for net zero are larger than a fair share of the global carbon budget. And here you have different assessments of what fair would mean, depending on different implementations of fairness. Or a country can have a net zero carbon credit if the country has not used its fair share. Yeah, this means that the past and the future emissions are below what the country could have emitted. I'll show you what this means for different regions on the next slide. So here you have the regional net zero CO2 emissions from fossil fuel and industry. And assuming because we have to get to zero, this translates to different pathways across regions. So for example, in Latin America, you have several countries that have a carbon credit. And here in more shaded in, you would have, depending on the phase out year, you would have carbon credit or carbon debt. While in sub-Saharan Africa, you always have carbon credit. And in Europe, you basically always have a carbon debt. And this is relevant for helping you understand the responsibility in overshoot, like how much overshoot you have because of the exact timing of the phase out. This is relevant also when you think about financing or international financing agreements, because net zero is not sufficient for some Annex 1 debtors when you look at this international perspective. And you need to support countries with low historic responsibilities, like African countries that I show you, or countries that have lower mitigation capacity. Also here, a paper from my colleague, from my supervisor, Shonali Pachari, is relevant, looking at these different ways of financing. And you might need additional net negative targets for countries that are in debt anyways, right? So this is one aspect that we also try to cover in JST-MIP. And when we look at these different questions that maybe come up, and this is now not only for the project that I've showed you, but within the current discourse in the scenario sphere, I would say, you have different areas of questions that come up. So the biodiversity, for example, or geological storage, or this effort sharing, or the decent living standard, or how you can look at addressing different inequality assumptions within energy. There's always different ways of how you can implement this in the model. And the way how you implement it is then connected in different ways to justice, right? And it's here, this table is an attempt to show that also this transparency of how certain questions are implemented in models already helps in understanding the strengths and the constraints within scenarios, and helps facilitate discussions, and also then connections with other disciplines that can also give insights on how this can be better tackled. Yeah. So just as an example, because we had this before, the biodiversity, that I had said that these model runs in JST-MIP will have stronger constraints on biodiversity. How do they do this? Usually there's a lot of biomass used in a lot of scenarios, and these the biomass and the biodiversity in these model runs is now aligned with BII. Here stands for Biodiversity Intactness Index, and we have different trajectory on this. So we look at regional hotspots of biodiversity, and these might then not enter the land use in the models. And at the same time, there is a global primary bioenergy ceiling across all runs to reduce the amount of bioenergy use. And so land is freed and giving back to nature and not used for biodiversity. So we can reduce the biodiversity loss and have land free of competition from other uses. Yeah, and this you can do obviously for all different kinds of assumptions if you do scenario runs, and you can think about, okay, how does this relate to intergenerational justice? How does this relate to interspecies justice? How does this relate to intra-regional justice? And what does this mean? And with this, I think now I would stop, because this I fear will get quite technical. And I hope, Manuela, this is okay if I stop here.
Sure. Actually,
sorry. I did want to show something else. I'm so sorry.
Go ahead.
Then I will share again. Do you see my screen? Yes. Okay. Sorry. I forgot that I actually wanted to start with this, and then I moved it to the back, and this is why I forgot about this. So this is a self-advertisement for the YASA Young Scientist Summer Program that we host every year at our institute for 3 months. It's a competitive program where we take around 50 doctoral students to work with us for 3 months on their research project. It always runs from beginning of June to the end of August. Application is still open until very early January 2026. So if you know someone for whom this could be of interest, please forward this information. If maybe this time is too tight, then just do this for 2027, basically. It's a very exciting program because you get to meet 50 other doctoral students from around the world. We have a lot of activities for the students, so cultural and also scientific. It's a great way to get to know our research, work interdisciplinary, think maybe outside of the box, and spend a nice summer at Luxembourg outside of Vienna. It's mostly funded through our national member organizations. It's a great way of doing research. And we usually recommend people to get in touch with our colleagues to identify interesting proposals. But unfortunately now with the holiday season starting, this might be too late for this time, but also applications without prior consultation are possible. Yeah. So thank you for helping us spread the word. And I know that especially from Japan, we would be very happy to get more applications. So please, and it's very interdisciplinary. So this is, I know I spoke about the modeling today, but if you look at the YASA homepage, we do demography, we do water research, we do participatory processes with local farmers. So it's all, I mean, we are very, maybe you find something that is relevant to you, even though the presentation today was not related to your work. Okay, thank you, Ms. Manuela, for giving me this space.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting and insightful presentation. Before I go to the questions and comments in the chat, I just want to use the opportunity of being the moderator to hog the attention just for my own question, just for a second, because I'm very interested in the last slide that you shared, where you showed how to translate the research questions. And
okay,
because what I'm very interested in is how you manage to combine the more abstract justice dimensions like recognitional, restorative, and intergenerational justice into the model. So at what point in the modeling process you can actually either implement or kind of operationalize these dimensions in what way? And I think the last slide is kind of like hinting at it.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I myself am not doing the model runs, right? So that's why within these processes, and what happened before, okay, maybe I should take a step back. Yeah. So what happened previously often is that already existing model runs were used and then analyzed from different equity perspectives. Yeah. For example, distributional aspects of mitigation efforts. Yeah. And this is one way of doing it. But then, of course, everything else that happened before, all these assumptions and all the scenario design that I talked about, like what is the opportunity space that you actually want to look at, they were dealt with as neutral. Yeah, they are not related to equity or justice, or at least the setup was seen as given. Yeah, and I think what has really happened in the last couple of years is that the justice and equity discussion enters earlier, already in the discussion about what is the research question, but also then, as you mentioned, how would we implement this within the models? Because there are different ways of doing it, right? And there's again a judgment in there. And also now there's also the discussion, okay, what can actually be changed in the models, right? Not only in the assumptions maybe, but in the model configuration. And here it really depends on the specific field, how much effort is needed, how much understanding there is, and how much I would say attention you give it to certain aspects, because some things are just more lower hanging fruits. It's easier to do, it's quicker to do, and maybe it's also more relevant from the attention than other aspects. Yeah, I mean, very basic is that, of course, you can increase transparency, but by being open about certain underlying assumptions that are very, very relevant, like discount rates, for example, and if they're not hidden in some documentation, right? Or the discussion that you then have, okay, what is actually a meaningful biomass constraint on global level? That's the first step. But then depending on the granularity of your model, you have to translate this down to regional constraints as well, maybe. And then, of course, you have this matchup of maybe empirical insights. Okay, where are the hotspots for biodiversity? Because it doesn't really, it's not the same which kind of land I free or I don't use in the model, right? And then this also, I mean, here I'm not the biodiversity modeler, so I should probably stop talking about this. But it's often you have certain constraints from the model setup as well, and also from the data availability, right? So a lot of this is also aspirational, and you always have to make I would say, pragmatic decisions in the end as well. But it's really, there's so many ways within the research process where you can come in. And we're definitely moving towards more of the beginning and to the core. Whereas before it was often ex post analysis. What are these implications for justice without considering previous justice relevant aspects, I would say.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to the questions in the chat first. There are also a couple of comments, but I want to give the questions a chance first. So the question here is, environmental economics has afforded to provide the measures by internalizing the negative impacts of environmental pollutions. What new aspects will be addressed by the concept of environmental justice? I'm not quite sure if I can follow the question.
Yeah, let me read it again. Environmental economics has afforded to provide the measures. So you mean maybe by internalizing the costs? What new aspects will be addressed by the concept of environmental justice? I don't think I can answer this question. I'm very sorry.
Well, then skip to the next question. So let's see if there's a comment. Okay, let's skip to the next question. So how models can or will incorporate the ICJ advisory opinion, which gives a lot of importance on the historical emissions of the countries? Asuka Sensei asked that question.
Yeah, so thank you. I actually had some slides also on the advisory opinion, but good that you brought this up. The carbon debt concept that I showed is one way of showing which country has which responsibility towards climate change. There's also a lot of work currently going on with attribution science, attributing historic responsibilities to attributing responsibility to high emitters, both with regards to corporations, but also with regards to countries. And this kind of science has already been used in certain court cases as evidence. Yeah, and this is important because the question is always how can science help climate litigation? I also had actually slides on this, but the time ran out. Yeah, because in climate litigation, be it now something for constitutional courts or for in what do you call this, in corporate law? Yeah, you have if you don't have scientific basis, that someone can claim to be responsible for a certain impact. Even though you get to the court, the courts will not continue. Sorry, my legal language is now leaving me. But with this attribution science, with this additional insight from the modeling, also how certain historic knowledge and how certain historic responsibilities can show a range in responsibility. This is really something that has been used now. I hope this answered your question. So the advisory opinion itself is maybe not incorporated in the model, but the insights from modeling and from attribution science that use these elements of different just allocation mechanisms, basically, they are then used at courts to also then implement these insights. Yeah.
And before going to the follow-up question by Asuka Sensei, I just want to point to the question after that, because you pretty much answered that question as well, because justice is already covered in legal discussions. So the question is, why is there no mention of legal systems whatsoever when we're discussing justice, which justice is already discussed within legal systems, as you mentioned, climate litigation processes. And so I think that would answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, just to Masako, very, very rightly pointed out, I had 3 more slides on legal systems and different court cases, but I should also say I'm not a legal scholar. I myself don't work really on climate litigation. We have colleagues who provide insights for the legal system, and I'm aware of this concept and I'm aware of this work, but we work more on bringing in these concepts into the modeling. So this would be probably a different talk. Yeah.
But climate litigation is both on a global level and on a regional level already quite moving. I mean, there are many there's climate litigation databases to see, and there are like laws covering environmental justices and so on. But I would like to go to Aska Sensei's follow-up question. I think you already kind of pointed that out. So he asked further, like carbon debt and responsibility discussion would be politically unacceptable for many developed countries. So how can scientists change developed countries' mindsets? Do you have any strategies or ideas?
Yeah. So some aspects of this, the global fair share concept were used, for example, in the EU advisory board, where our program director, Keivan Riyahi, is a scientific advisor. And this concept that also was co-developed by Setu Peltz made into this advisory body or work. And this was very important in the setting for at least the EU target of net negative the timing. So the timing target and the ambition level for the EU was very strongly influenced by this concept of, okay, the responsibility actually lies within developed countries who have previously, I mean, not all, of course, yeah. So of course, it's also a question of the political setup and the zeitgeist, I would say. But within the EU, this insight has helped set the target and the timing. How strategies, ideas for circumstances where this might not meet the zeitgeist, maybe like in the US at the moment. I have to admit, I don't have that, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay, then let's go to the next question. I was like a more like comment, I think. I hope the environmental justice would provide the better object function to achieve the preferable future than the conventional economic efficiency, especially under uncertainties. But currently, it is far from the quantification of justice, quote unquote justice. Some partial descriptions are available, so please show us the view on the development of justice indicator. We already have sense considerations, of course. I think some sense considerations goes to the capabilities approach.
Yeah. I mean, my understanding of the question, and I hope I got it right, especially let's talk about the distributions. Yeah. So if you have a certain resource and you want to distribute it in a fair way, there will be very different perceptions on what is fair, right? You could have it, you can have a per capita distribution. You can have, as you mentioned, something that is related to the capabilities. What are the needs? Do you have a prioritarian approach where those who have the least get served first? Do you have a sufficientarian perspective that everybody gets at least some? And if somebody needs more, it's okay. Do you have a limitarian perspective? This might be maybe more for a pollution indicator that you don't care how much someone has, at least somebody doesn't have more than something else. So there's different ways of looking at distributions, different principles that everybody context specific would have a different perception on what is fair to them. So I don't think that there is there is a justice indicator. There is not even one single way of distributing something in a fair manner. And fairness often is connotated with a subjective perception of what I think is fair to me in that moment. So this is also something that is different from justice per se. So maybe when also this happens when we looked at the national determined contributions in the first phase, a lot of countries actually claimed that what they submitted was their fair contribution, was fair to them. And when you then add it up, it was too much, right? It was outside of the trajectories of staying within the Paris Agreement. So you have this challenge between what is considered fair by an individual, what overall matches up and is ambitious enough. But there is the argument that if more participants to an agreement think that it's fair, that it's going to be more ambitious and also more likely to be implemented. And so I think that if you show diversity of different implementations of justice and these principles, and you start a negotiation process because there's different ways of cutting the cake, right? At least you still talk to each other, and you find maybe ways for compromise. But we also saw that within the Paris Agreement, then if everybody just does what's fair to them, it's not sufficient.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We are almost out of time, but I think this whole question of how to measure or what indicators to use when it comes to justice analysis I think it's because the whole justice scholarship is getting more complex than more simple, because the more it goes, there's more dimensions coming up, more layers of all the justice analyses coming up. So I think it's a very difficult question, and also not all of it is quantifiable, or maybe shouldn't be quantifiable. I mean, this is where qualitative research comes in, and you talked about the pathways in correlation in complementary to the scenarios. So I think as we go along, the more complex it becomes. I understand the question. Yeah. But thank you very much for today. We are out of time, but I really appreciate your taking the time today in the morning in Austria. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much for providing us with your insights, and I really hope we can continue the discussion. And with that, I'm closing today's webinar, and thank every participants for joining and all the questions and comments. Thank you very much. And some applause. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and wishing you a nice evening in Japan or wherever you are. And
thank you very much. Have a nice day.